Hello, good morning, welcome back. Uh, Today we are on chapter 17, which is a very tiny chapter. It's a postscript to last week's uh, evocation of Orobas. But it's so short that we're going to start the very long chapter, chapter 18, which is Israel Regarde, and the exorcism of Garkon, which is a very interesting interesting chapter too. So I hope you're all comfortable. Hope you've got your coffee and have settled in and are ready to continue with my life with the spirits. Right now, the mini chapter 17, postscript to the evocation of Orobas. It is customary in Solomonic magic for the magician to hide the charred sigil of the spirit in a secret place. No one except the magician should touch the sigil or even look upon it. The theory is that the magician, having been protected from the malice of the spirit by the circle and the holy names during the initial conjuration, remains so protected after the ceremony. However, any other person who may come in contact with the sigil is unprotected and totally vulnerable to the demon's influence. After my first evocation of Orobas, I put his parchment sigil in a small linen bag and put the bag inside my guitar. As I allowed no one to touch my precious C.F. Martin D28, I thought it would be supremely safe there. I also probably hoped that it might attract new guitar students or recording opportunities. Predictably, after a few weeks, I'd forgotten that I had put it there and did not give it another thought until it was too late. Kurt was an old friend of one of my guitar students. He was a young man in his early 20s and a talented woodworker. His specialty was mother of pearl and abalone shell inlay. He showed me photographs of his work, and I was very impressed. He said he'd like to do the same custom inlay on my Martin in exchange for guitar lessons. This was an offer I could not refuse, and I greedily commissioned him to inlay an Egyptian winged solar disk on the headpiece. He told me he'd need the guitar for a week. 5 days later, he returned with the finished product. It was beautiful, a fabulous job. I asked if he was ready to take his first lesson, but he said he couldn't because he was going to accompany his father to the racetrack. Are you a race fan? I asked. Not until yesterday, he said excitedly. My dad and I spent the whole day at Santa Anita. I just fell in love with the horses. We went down to the paddock before each race to get a close look. They're so beautiful. They're like gods. And when they look at me, I feel just like a horse. And then he whinnied like a horse. Kurt's enthusiasm was almost embarrassing. He was obsessed to the point of being creepy. Before he got on his bicycle to leave, he said, "Oh, while I was working on your guitar, a little bag dropped out. I opened it and saw the little weird thing you have got in there." I thought, oh, I better not mess with Lon's magic weird thing, so I put it back in the bag. It sure smells good. Hope I didn't screw anything up. I was stunned silent. Orobas got out. Now this guy thought he was a horse. No, I lied to him. I just put it in there to make my guitar smell like cinnamon. What could I tell him? Kurt stayed part of our magical scene for the next 15 years. during which time he constructed many of our magical tools and pieces of lodge furniture. Sadly, his addiction to horse racing and other forms of gambling escalated year by year into self-destructive behavior that eventually rendered him socially crippled. The last time I saw him, he was living in a small industrial shop, the walls of his cell surrounded by hundreds of color photographs and posters of racehorses. Now, the reader may be asking at this point, why didn't I just conjure Orobas again and simply command him to leave Kurt alone? I did. I did on numerous occasions throughout the 15 years we knew Kurt. I conjured Orobas on the poor man's behalf. Each time my charge was, if you are responsible for Kurt's behavior, leave him in peace. If you are not the cause of his torment, do what is in your power to help him. Kurt's degeneration continued unabated. I cannot think that accidental contact with a tiny piece of parchment was the cause of Kurt's ruin. Everything we know about addictive personality suggests that sooner or later he was going to get caught up in something, be it drugs or drink or gambling. Though science and medicine may speculate upon the physiological causes, and psychiatry may point to a childhood experience and trauma, and organized religion may blame on man's inherent wickedness, all, in my opinion, fall pitifully short of a satisfactory explanation to the awful curse that tormented Kurt. As I said in the introduction of this book, magic is an art. If science, medicine, and religion cannot really answer these questions, why can't we be poetic when considering such mysteries and our inability to understand them? Perhaps the chemical imbalance in Kurt's blood, perhaps his mother's cold rejection, perhaps the monstrous doctrines of guilt and self-hatred heaped upon him year after year from the pulpit. Perhaps all these things, united in a diabolical marriage that gave birth to an evil spirit, a demon horse who escaped its wizard long enough to gallop madly into the vulnerable soul of a weak and tragic human being. And that's the end of the postscript. I'm going to turn a couple things off here on my screen that have popped up. And now we're going to chapter 18, Israel Regardie and the exorcism of Garkon. And we won't get through this chapter this time, but we'll end it at a good spot. Early in 1980, I secured a comfortable position as a laboratory technician at yet another medical device laboratory. I was lucky to work for a dear woman who was absolutely fascinated with my extracurricular magical activities. One morning, she burst into the lab and gushed, "Lon, pick up line 2. It's a Dr. Regardie, and he wants to speak to Bishop DuQuette." Israel Regardie was my hero. A true adept and a living page of magical history, he was Aleister Crowley's secretary and student in the 1920s, and later went on to rend the veil of the Golden Dawn with his controversial publication of its ceremonies and teachings. His books are the indispensable core of every English-speaking magician's library. He lived about 60 miles away in Studio City, Constance and I had been introduced to him a few years earlier by Grady McMurtry, the caliph of the OTO. I had met with him only twice since then, and we exchanged a few letters concerning a particular project dear to us both. And the footnote talks about that project, as we both had collections of letters from individuals claiming to be the incarnation of Aleister Crowley. I suggested we pool our stories and publish them as Lieber Nuts. He liked the idea and sent me on several field trips to interview new Crowley incarnations as they surfaced. The phone call was obviously a joke. Rigardi had a playfully twisted sense of humor. A few years earlier, he'd donated a box of books to Haru Raha Lodge, and I was sure he was calling to tell me he had more. Lon, this is Francis Rigardi. Dear boy, I hope I haven't gotten you fired. He didn't mean it. Oh, everyone here knows I'm crazy. I didn't mean it. I was wondering if you could do me a bit of a favor. I need a bishop. As I'm sure you know, it takes a bishop to order an exorcism. Now I really knew he was joking. I solemnly deepened my voice in mock virility. Why, yes, doctor, of course, naturally. How many exorcisms shall I put you down for? I smiled and winked at my boss. My smile quickly faded as I realized he was not joking. As it turned out, a psychiatrist friend of his was treating a patient who was convinced that she needed a formal exorcism. The woman was knowledgeable enough to know that classic exorcisms must be performed under the direct auspices of a bishop with legitimate apostolic succession or apostolic lineage. Your line is as good as any, and I'm sure we can't get a Christer to cooperate on such short notice. Of course, she just needs a show. I thought you might know someone in your lodge who can give her one. I couldn't believe he was asking me to do this. I giggled nervously and mumbled something. It's really quite sad, actually. If you're up to it, you'll need to talk to her doctor. Do you have a pencil? Before I had the presence of mind to protest or ask any more questions, he dictated the name and number of a Dr. Kaufman in Long Beach. Before I hung up, I reminded him that he too was a wandering bishop and asked why he didn't arrange the exorcism. I just did. Do tell me how it goes. He hung up. A few minutes later, I called Dr. Kaufman. She was a pleasant-sounding woman who was very serious about scheduling an exorcism. Rigardi had been her Reichian therapist, and she admired him passionately. Although she made it quite clear she did not believe in demons and spirits and other psychological metaphors, other than being psychological metaphors, she was familiar with the fundamentals of Hermetic thought and respected its potential in modern therapy. I didn't need to ask any questions. She just started talking and was very candid. The subject was a 38-year-old woman named Sharon. Her husband had recently committed suicide, and she was left with 3 children ranging in ages from 11 to 16. When she was 2 years old, her stepfather began sexually molesting her on a regular basis. Early on in this monstrous cycle of abuse, Sharon created a make-believe guardian, a friendly dragon named Garkon, who came and delivered her to happy places while her little body was being violated. He helped her survive her nightmarish existence, and for years this double life kept her relatively sane. As she grew older, however, her champion's character began to change. Shortly after she started school and began noticing boys, Garcon's rescues were spiked with random acts of petty cruelty, a sharp dragon nip on the tummy or an ill-tempered scratch on her face. Ironically, Sharon felt that she deserved these little punishments and suffered them gladly, for without question her fantasy life with Garcon was infinitely preferable to the nightly visits from her stepfather. The years of abuse finally ended when she was 14. Her stepfather lost his head completely in a skillful display of physical contortion, requiring the use of a kitchen table, the big toe of his right foot, and a 10-gauge shotgun. That night, when Sharon went to bed, she dared to fantasize a new life free of the horrors of her early childhood. She would no longer need Garcon to rescue her. Indeed, Garcon was a reminder of everything she wanted to forget. But Garcon did not go away. The next night, he swept into Sharon's bedroom. He had grown to an enormous size and lost all vestiges of his old friendly countenance. He boasted that he had eaten her stepfather's head and vowed that no man would ever hurt her again. The dynamics are pretty simple, Dr. Kaufman said. He torments her cruelty whenever any factor of sexuality enters her life equation. In high school, she avoided the dating scene altogether and concentrated on her studies. She married in her junior year of college, but because she could never enjoy lovemaking without arousing Garcon's wrath, the marriage was predictably an unhappy one. The ordeal of conceiving and bearing children was excruciating. She nearly died during each of her 3 pregnancies. She was perpetually nauseous and often lost consciousness. After the birth of her 3rd child, she and her husband ended their sexual relationship altogether, and for 10 years, Garcon slumbered. The truce was shattered when Sharon's husband committed suicide after a business failure. Many old issues from her childhood resurfaced, including Garcon. This time she resolved not to face the problem alone. She sought out psychological counseling. This act of spiritual independence enraged Garcon, who now, sensing the danger to his very existence, was escalating his nightly attacks and making Sharon's life unbearable. She contemplated suicide, an idea that Garcon wholeheartedly endorsed. Instead, she settled on the idea of an exorcism. Her psychologist would have none of it and referred her to Dr. Kaufman, thinking that at least a psychiatrist could prescribe appropriate medication. Dr. Kaufman resisted drug therapy, but was willing to explore exorcism as a psychodramatic exercise. I didn't know what to say. The story was very compelling. Dr. Kaufman seemed anxious, and I appreciate the psychological significance of Sharon's possession, and was quite patient enough to keep pointing out how all this was perfectly understandable from an analytical point of view. I wanted to help, but this was serious stuff. I could barely keep my own demons from eating me. I certainly did not feel equipped to exorcise such a formidable psychic entity from someone else. Still, it seemed as if the whole universe and my magical hero had conspired to put me in the middle of this situation. I thought for a moment who I might know among my eccentric and bohemian cronies who was knowledgeable enough and crazy enough to be my exorcist. The answer came to me immediately. I know who can do it if he will agree. When do you want this done? Tonight, Dr. Kaufman answered, as though she was sure I should have already known that. At my home in Long Beach. And that's where we're going to end today. We'll pick this up tomorrow, Monday. Have a wonderful and safe rest of your weekend. Be good to yourself. Be good to each other. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law. Love and will. Bye.